Hi, in this video I'm going to give you some tips and tricks for crocheting with twine, because obviously this is not really been specifically designed for crocheting, and there's just a few things you need to allow for and bear in mind in order to get the most out of crocheting with it. So in the latest issue of Journals of Scottish Yarns, I've designed this twine bag. I'll put a photo of it up now. I've actually made all the samples in the journal. So originally it was designed as a single colour, but then actually when I was double checking my pattern notes that I'd written, I didn't have enough yarn, enough twine left for a single coloured version, so I ended up making a multicoloured one as well, which has turned out to be really more popular than the plain ones. So I'll talk a little bit about changing colour as well. And by the way, Journals of Scottish Yarn issue 3 is now available for sale, and you can also join a make along that's being hosted by Anne from I Thought I Knew How podcast, where you can make this twine bag, or there's lots and lots of other lovely patterns in there, and you follow some prompts on Instagram and you can win some prizes. So working with twine, I've got a couple of things I'm going to go through. You know, setting realistic expectations about what it's like to crochet with twine. I'm going to talk about what kind of hook you should use, some of the properties of the twine that means you need to take consideration about how and where you're crocheting, how to you know, fasten off, sewing in ends and blocking and stuff, because it's all has slightly different things are required than just using your traditional cottons, acrylics, wools or whatever. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is the expectation of working with twine. So obviously, as I've said, it's not been designed to be crocheted with, and as an actual fibre, as a yarn, it has literally got no stretch whatsoever. So when you actually make something, the only stretch you're going to get is being generated by the actual stitch structure. So actually in some ways this is really great, because if you need a fabric that's very has got a good structure and is very solid and stable, like for a little bag like this, then it's absolutely perfect. So obviously you wouldn't use it for clothing or anything like that, but for bags, maybe even mats or things like that, it's a really good material. So it takes a certain sort of a different mindset to crochet with this. If you come into this project, you know, as if you are going to be crocheting with your favorite cotton yarn, and as I said, a normal crocheter could probably whip up this project in a couple of evenings, because it's you know, there's not that much to it really. But with this, you might have to kind of acclimatise yourself to the crocheting. So it might be that you do a little bit at a time and sort of build up your sort of resilience to crocheting with this. And I think it's the lack of stretch and the sort of rustic nature of the yarn that makes it a little bit more difficult when you're getting through stitches, because there's no stretch, so it's difficult to get the hook through. Pulling up, obviously there's a lot of tightness and a lot of friction, so it does require a bit more strength in your fingers. And as Anne said in the podcast I did with her recently when we were discussing crocheting with twine, she used a really good term for it, which she said is quite a muscular type of crochet. But I don't really want that to put you off, because you know, it doesn't take very long to actually build up quite a good sort of level of acclimatization to crocheting with this twine. However, having said that, you can swap out the twine for some Aran weight cotton. You would just get a bag that's a little bit floppier, or you could go down a hook size and just make a smaller bag that would be a bit stiffer in the Aran cotton. So we've talked about the expectations of crocheting with this and just seeing it as like sort of a separate category within your normal crocheting, and that you can't really just pick it up and knock out a whole series of motifs really quickly until you've really got used to this slightly different way of crocheting. So I'm going to talk about the hook. So with a hook, what you really need is a good quality hook that is an all-in-one hook that doesn't have a separate handle. So by that I mean sort of one of these, because what happens, with it being quite a muscular type of crochet, what happens is this handle can come off, and you don't want to ruin your nice hooks. So I think this is a zing crochet hook. It's quite good quality. However, you will need a smaller hook for sewing in ends and fastening off, because we're not going to use a needle for that, because it doesn't really work very well with a tapestry needle. It works much better with a smaller hook. So I'm using a 4.5mm hook for this twine, and this twine is listed as number 3 on Nutscene. The other thing to bear in mind about twines, they don't really have a standardized thickness as such. You know, some companies just have thick twine, thin twine, whatever. If you want to make this bag exactly as it is, I would recommend getting the Nutscene twine, because obviously it's tried and tested and we know it works with this pattern. If you get some random twine off the internet, can't guarantee how thick it is, or whether you'll have enough yardage for it. So, and this is actually pretty good value, and there are loads and loads of colours. I mean, I've only got a small selection here, but there's all kinds of really bright colours. There's pinks and purples and yellows and blues, you know, any colour you would like, whether you prefer the more natural colours or something a bit more funky. Nutscene has got a super duper range for you there. So yeah, so where was I? Yeah, so I've used 4.5mm for this Nutscene number 3 twine, and I'm using a 3.5 for the fastening off and the weaving in of the ends. So as you can already see from just a little bit of work I've been doing here, you can see that this twine sheds a lot of fibres. So, and obviously it's been designed to be used outside, really. It's not been designed as a indoor craft material as such. So I would recommend doing any work with this in a well ventilated room. You know, a sunny day on your patio is ideal. If not, make sure you've got your window open or something like that, just because you don't really want all these little particles going into your lungs. Even though it is a natural fibre, not sure it would be safe to inhale these ones with the dyes in. Plus it does make you cough a bit. So I would say well ventilated room, and as discussed with Anne on her podcast, you know, you can put a towel on your lap or something if you don't want it getting on your clothes. But to be honest, that kind of thing didn't really bother me or stop me from doing this. So a lot of people have said to me, oh, that working with that twine must have really killed your fingers. So the first thing I would say is that it's actually not as rough as you would expect it to be. However, as I said before, it's not exactly cashmere, so you know, let's be honest, and it is a rough fibre, but is actually, once you get going with it, it's not as bad as you think. So if you actually are just crocheting in short bursts to build up your stamina, so to speak, then you shouldn't have any problems at all. I actually work the way I crochet, I'm feeding the yarn over my index finger, and the only time I had a problem was when I was making the samples in the magazine, and I had to crochet 3 bags, 2 samples for the magazine and then 1 for helping me to write up the instructions. And then I did find that I was getting a bit of a friction burn there, but all I did then was I just got one of those finger plasters and just plastered it round, and then that reduced the friction. So obviously if you're a thrower, so some people actually wrap the yarn, when they crochet they wrap the yarn round the hook with the finger rather than using the hook like I do to collect the yarn. You shouldn't have a problem at all really. So next I'm going to talk about how you actually work from this spool of twine. Do you work from the outside, or do you do centre pull? So the first time I started working with this twine, I didn't actually read the label or anything. I just went straight ahead and do what I always do, which is take off the ball band and just start working with it. So to start with, that's fine, but then the more of the spool you use, it actually starts to really lose its shape and structure. So you can see this was the original shape, and then the more you use it, it becomes elongated, and then it does what centre pull does, which is one of the things I don't like about centre pull. It actually just collapses in on itself and becomes a bit of a mess. So this one hasn't got to that point, but it does eventually. So I am guilty in this case of not actually reading the label, because it does clearly say do not detach the wrapper. So then from then on, once I realised that, I do now leave it on the wrapper and use it centre pull, and I found that it all stays together without all collapsing and tangling for much longer. I can't guarantee that it works for all brands of twine, because I don't know how they've been spooled, but for Nutscene, you know, there is clearly a reason why they've put that message on there. So when designing this bag, the part that took me the absolute longest was actually designing a motif that was easy to work, but also provided enough of a solid fabric to make a good bag. Because my first few attempts at making a motif, I discovered that it's not that enjoyable to have to work into every single stitch, just because of the nature of the fibre being so unelastic and quite a lot of friction going on there. So that took me the longest. That was the longest part of the design process, was finding a motif that could be easily transferred into the different shapes. So that obviously the bag is made up of squares, pentagons and hexagons. So I've developed a motif where you're working a lot of stitches into spaces, and you're only working into stitches occasionally. So if you're not making the bag, but you're thinking of working some other kind of projects or in twine, then I would recommend looking for patterns that are worked into spaces, you know, such as mesh stitches, or quite open projects where you're not having to work into every single stitch like this. I mean, you can do it if you want to. If you're a glutton for punishment, you might enjoy that. But actually, after you've made these bags and you've built up quite a good bit of strength in your fingers, then maybe if I tried this again now, I would actually find it much easier. But anyway, so that's one element of the design process of this bag, was to make sure that a lot of the time we're working into spaces, which makes the whole thing a lot more fun. So next I'm going to talk about fastening off. Obviously, fastening off is one of the times where you do need to work into another stitch, and if it's actually, you'll save yourself a lot of trouble by switching to a smaller hook at this point. So as I said before, I'm using a 4.5, and then for the fastening off, I'm going to switch to a 3.5. So where you need to slip stitch into, X chain of X, beginning chain, whatever's going on, or maybe slip stitch into a first stitch or something, it's so much easier going through the element of the motif you need to work into with a hook size down. And when we finish with a slip stitch, but what we want to avoid doing is fastening off in the normal way, i.e. then pulling that through, because it makes a little knot. And because this is a very unyielding fabric, those knots become too visible for my liking. So what I actually do here is something you wouldn't normally do with normal fabric, because normal yarn, because it would probably come undone. But what I do is, after I've done the slip stitch, I don't fasten off in the normal way. I actually pull the live loop open like you would for a sewn bind off. And obviously that at the moment isn't very stable. But then I like to turn the work round to the back, and in this case I'm working into some chains that I'm never going to work a stitch into. So it's a corner space. I'm going to be working round that in the future, so I'm not bothered about making this difficult to work into for my next stitch, because I'm never actually going to put another stitch in there. So I've picked one of the chains in the chain 2 corner, and because obviously when you're sewing with a needle, you're pushing the fabric, you're pushing the yarn through. With a hook, you're doing the opposite, you're pulling it through. So whatever you would normally do with a needle, when you're using a hook, you need to do it the reverse direction. So I'm coming from the back through that second chain, and then I'm pulling the yarn through. So this is kind of like a bit of a cross between a sewn bind off and your normal slip stitch finish. So I've fastened off, I've done that first, so what I've done is a slip stitch, then I've pulled the live loop out, then I've threaded the tail end through one of these chains, and then the next thing is, I'm still on the back here, I'm just going to work through some of the back ridges of this first, that first chain I made there actually, for that round, and I'm just looping it through a couple of times. And then that is actually enough to secure that, because these motifs are going to be joined in multiple places. So that's how I fasten off. So what that means is that you've got a relatively secure fastening, but you haven't got the lump of the full slip stitch and fasten off thing that's traditional with normal yarns. You get a flatter finish. So we're going to do a similar thing for sewing in ends. So for sewing in ends, I'm going to use the hook as well, and remember what I said a minute ago about you're always going in the opposite direction. So with a needle, you would thread the needle and you would push it through there, but with a hook I'm coming the opposite direction. So I'm going to come through there, and remember when you're sewing in ends like this, I want to sort of skip that first one, because otherwise I'm just pulling it back, undoing whatever was already done there, because I've caught that end in when I was crocheting. So, and for this I would say don't worry if you split the yarn, because you can actually use that to your advantage. So with sewing in ends, we always want to go one direction and then change directions to stop it coming undone, and wherever possible it's quite good to sort of split some of these legs at the back with the hook. Say here for example it's split, doesn't really matter, I just pull through a couple of bits, stick the hook in again, make sure I catch something or split that first leg. You don't want to be pulling it back exactly the same way you just brought it. So that is enough to secure those ends there. And obviously same as with normal crochet, you're always trying to sew or conceal the ends in congested areas like this. So where I've got this tail, rather than trying to sew it in along this bit, which is quite open, it's much better to hook it through this little congested area. So again, I'm just going to get, I might start one stitch in actually. I'm just going to get my hook, weave that through there. I'm going to pop up through the first leg of that stitch and split it, and then pull the yarn through. Pull everything back into shape because you want to match tension. And again, when you're doing this second step, it's probably better to start slightly within this section rather than right at the end, because if the end does ever pop out, it pops out on the inside rather than popping out where there's, you know, like a hole where it could sneak through onto the right side. So I'm popping up again, splitting this first leg just so that I'm not undoing what I've already done, and then that is absolutely adequate to keep that really nice and secure. So there you are, there's some tips for finishing off rounds and sewing in ends. So the last thing I'm going to talk about is changing colours, and it's not really that different to normal crocheting, or not different at all really. But the pattern in Journals of Scottish Yarn is obviously written for one coloured version, and there is in there just like a little brief description of how to change colours. So the only thing I would say is, because you need to follow this bag pattern very carefully, because some of the motifs are all the same, so the squares are all symmetrical and they're all the same, but some of the motifs, such as the hexagons and the pentagons on the side, they're not all symmetrical, and this is because to stop these edges of the bag being too pointy and too flared out, I had to reduce some stitches around the edges. So that's just something to bear in mind, is that not to go into autopilot and just think, oh, you know, that's X stitches on this side, X numbers of spaces, and I just need to repeat that all the way round. You can do that for the squares, but these are all, although they are symmetrical to each other, they are within themselves, they are different, so you do need to pay attention to that. So that's why when you're adding a new colour, you always need to join that new colour in the same corner that you started. So normally I discourage that, because it draws your eye. When you keep changing colour and you're always adding it in the same corner, your eye gets drawn to the slight difference with the chain start and everything. But in this case, it would be very confusing if you started to join the colour in a different corner or a different spot to where you finished, just because of the way the pattern sequence doesn't follow, you know, a set pattern. So I would say make sure you join in exactly the same place you finished, and to join the yarn, use the hold the tail at the back method to reduce bulk, because as I said, there's zero stretch to this yarn, so when you are working into it, working with it, knots and stuff become very visible. So if you start off with the way some people like, i.e., you know, you start with a slip knot loop and then you join the yarn, that is just really not going to look good, and also it's going to make it quite lumpy. So we're going to do tail at the back and then pull up a loop, which doesn't count as a stitch, and then you proceed into pattern. So I know a lot of people find this disconcerting because you've got this tail end at the back. You just keep a hold of it for a little bit, and actually with the twine, what you can do is make your first chain, get the tail end, and from the left hand side wrap it round. So between the live loop and the feed, you can wrap the tail across and then do your next single crochet, and then get the tail end and wrap it back over to the other side. And then however many chains you've got, you can do that if you want to secure that straight away. So that's one way of doing it. It also puffs up that chain a bit, because that starting chain can sometimes be a little bit skinny, can't it? So that's also a good way of doing that. And actually, even at this point, you could just chop that off, because this has got so much friction to it that that's not really going to be going anywhere now. So that's one way, that's how I would recommend joining a new colour to a round that minimises knots, and also you're sewing in the end at the same time, really. Let's talk next about blocking. So it is well worth blocking your bag or whatever you're making, but there's a few things to bear in mind. So I made the mistake the first time I made a prototype of one of these bags was to wash it. So I always wash stuff to block it, and to my horror, it took about 5 days to dry. Because it just absorbs so much water that if you soak it all the way through, it just takes forever to dry. So the best way I found for blocking is with a steam iron and some damp cloths. So not sure if I've actually got room here to demonstrate, but what I did was I got a bunch of old tea towels like this, and got them wet and then wringed them out until they were just damp, and then I tried to fold them so that they were about the same width as the bag, and then rolled it up into like this damp clothy sausage like this. So this is obviously dry, but I'm just showing you for the sake of the video. And then I sort of wedged it inside the bag. So this took me a couple of attempts to get it the right size, because you kind of really want it almost exactly the right size. So it's in there in the bag like that. And then you need to get another damp tea towel. This one's seen better days. It's a mangy old Christmas, I don't know why. I usually try and put these away at the end of Christmas, but this one's somehow hung around. I think it needs to be ditched or recycled or something. So then I'd get this one damp, and then you get your iron, and you can have it on actually quite a hot steam setting, and then you just kind of sort of hold it on there. You don't want to be pressing down too much. You don't want to be actually using physical pressure. You're just kind of a gentle pressure, but sort of quite prolonged periods of hold with the steam and the damp cloth, and just working your way all around the bag, turning it over, doing the same on the other side. And then of course you can also focus on these edge bits of the bag in the same way by, you know, getting it and kind of pressing it into the correct shape. So this isn't, it's not massively time consuming. It's just, again, you take your time, you know, hold it on each bit for like 10 seconds or something, and just keep going round the bag, checking occasionally. You will notice a significant difference that does really finish it off really nicely. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that. Thanks for listening and watching. I hope you find it useful. And if you want to join the make along, which is going on right now, so time of filming this is July 2023. We're having a make along hosted by Anne Frost from I Thought I Knew How. I'll put a link to her podcast in the comments. To take part in the make along, there's absolutely loads of patterns, really beautiful patterns in this latest issue of Journals of Scottish Yarns. You can make any of these, but you do need to purchase the yarn journal, which I'll also put a link to. And there are prompts on Instagram, Facebook and Ravelry. You can pick one to take part in, and you can win some prizes. So yeah, hope you can join us. Thanks again, and hopefully speak to you soon.